Now let me start session 1. Addressing low birth rate and promoting gender equality, the global experience with case studies. Ambassadors and deputy heads of mission of 5 countries will share with us their countries' experiences and policies for gender equality. Now let me hand over the microphone to the chair of session 1, Minister of Gender Equality and the Family of the Republic of Korea, Kim Hyun-sook. So can you listen to my voice well? As was introduced, I am Kim Hyun-sook, Minister of Gender Equality and the Family of the Republic of Korea. Participants, speakers in the on-site and online audience, let me extend my gratitude and warm welcome to all of the participants. In session 1, we will listen to presentations on the policies and experiences for gender equality from ambassadors and deputy heads of mission of 5 countries. Let me introduce our speakers for session 1. The first presenter will be Daniel Wolvén, Ambassador of Sweden to the Republic of Korea. The second speaker is Kari Hansen OVIND, Ambassador of Norway to Korea. And the third speaker is Tamara Mawhinney, Ambassador of Canada to Korea. And the fourth speaker is Alexandra Siddall, Minister and Deputy Head of Mission of Australian Embassy to Korea. And last but not least, the fifth speaker is Gareth Weir, Deputy Head of Mission of British Embassy to Seoul. And Daniel Wolvén, Ambassador of Sweden to the Republic of Korea, will give us their presentation on gender equality, work, and childcare in Sweden. Daniel Wolvén took office in Korea in December 2021. After that, he is working so hard to promote a bilateral relationship between Korea and Sweden. You have the floor, Ambassador.
Thank you, Minister Kim Hyun-sook, Excellencies, dear fellow speakers, guests, ladies and gentlemen, Anjong Hashimnika, Chonan Daniel Wolvén, Johan Sveden Tessay. I feel very honored to be here today and share some thoughts about Sweden, about our history of championing gender equality and what we have done over the years to maintain stable birth rates while striving for advances in gender equality. And let me start by extending my sincere gratitude to the Ministry of Gender Equality and Family for inviting me to this meaningful event. Now, despite vast geographical distance, Sweden and the Republic of Korea, we share many similarities. Both countries have gone from being poor rural societies to becoming fully knowledge-based economies and becoming 2 of the most innovative nations in the world. Both our countries are also heavily dependent on international free trade and multilateral cooperation, and our economies rely on a skilled workforce that underpin exports in high-tech sectors. I wanted to talk about a few factors that I believe have contributed to making Sweden a rather prosperous and equal society. A society in which the responsibilities of childcare coexist with a competitive, equal labor market, and a society in which most people, irrespective of gender, would say that they have a fair chance to realize their dreams and their full potential. But before I begin, let me start by saying that I'm not here to sell the Swedish model, as it were, or to say that South Korea should replicate reforms that have been pushed in Sweden. I think each society must choose its own path based on their very own history, experience, and circumstances. And I wanted to add that Sweden has certainly as much to learn from South Korea as South Korea has to learn from Sweden. I think some of us remember what the former American President Bill Clinton used to say. He said that there is no problem in America that has not been solved somewhere in America. And to paraphrase that, I would like to say there's probably no social problem that hasn't been solved either in Sweden or in South Korea. So I believe we really do have a lot to learn from each other. Wanted to say that at the end of the 19th century, Sweden was one of the poorest countries in Europe. Over the course of a century, Sweden managed to develop into one of the most prosperous and equal countries in the world. And I think, as with Korea's own extraordinary economic journey, several factors made this possible. I would like to highlight a few here, namely the social forces that determinedly worked towards a more inclusive, innovative, and equal society. Sweden has been known and is known today for being an individualistic country. The key concept in our system is to maximize individual autonomy. Women should not be economically dependent on men, children should not be economically dependent on their parents, or vice versa when they get older. Older parents should not be dependent on their children, and so on and so forth. This doesn't mean that Swedes don't like family life, but it means that the starting point of the Swedish society and the starting point of our welfare system is really the individual. And together with this focus on the individual also comes a strong feeling of egalitarianism. This has led to a firm belief in the need to redistribute income in order to avoid large gaps between rich and poor, and an ambition to provide equal societal services. Now, Sweden is also known as a gender equal society. Gender equality is a goal in and of itself, but gender equality is also about economics. We have realized that in order to grow and to maintain our welfare model, we need to use the capacities of both men and women. I wish I had, like the previous speaker, some nice pictures of fathers and mothers and children. I don't have that here. I have some pictures of raw brute statistics, but I hope you will bear with me. So the OECD estimates that 10 to 20% of GDP growth per capita in Sweden and the Nordic countries over the past 40, 50 years can be attributed to an increase in female employment. If a larger part of the population is working, the tax base will also be higher. So in 2018, Sweden had the highest ratio of both working men and women in the European Union, with 80% of women in working age having a formal job. So we believe that it's important that women and men have the same opportunities to engage in paid work that provides economic independence throughout their lives. And here you can see female labor force participation in Sweden and in the European Union. When women are empowered, both at the workplace and at home, individuals, communities, and the whole economy is of course better off. And my main point here is that high female labor participation does not imply lower birth rates. Fertility, if you look at fertility in Sweden, it has declined at the margin over the last 10 years, but we still have one of the highest birth rates in the OECD at about 1.7 children per woman. This wasn't always the case. In the 1970s, Sweden's birth rates were among the lowest in Europe. However, birth rates have been kept stable since then. And when you look at the statistics, it's difficult to draw a direct link between gender equality and high birth rates, but it is quite certain that a few critical reforms aimed at advancing gender equality by supporting the ability of women and men to not only enter but also remain on the labor market on equal footing, and to do so while building a family, have had a positive impact on fertility and natality in Sweden. And I wanted to mention a few, but I also wanted to show you a statistic of the fertility rates, birth per women in Sweden, the European Union, and Korea, which we have already seen. So let me just finish by mentioning a few of the reforms that have taken place in Sweden. In 1971, we had the separate income tax assessment for wife and husband, which replaced joint family taxation. And this created incentives for married women to participate in the labor market to a greater extent. In 1974, Sweden was the first country to introduce a gender-neutral parental leave system that entitled parents to share the duty of taking care of their children. So when a woman gives birth to a child, the family has the right to 16 months paid leave with 85% of their normal salary. And out of these 16 months, 3 months can only be used by one of the parents. So that is a way of incentivizing both parents to take part of the parental leave. Today, Swedish fathers are among the most likely in the OECD to take paid child-related leave. I count myself among those fathers. I have taken parental leave for both my son and my daughter, and in both cases quite extensively so. Now, additionally, I want to say something about the daycare and preschool system, which was expanded already in the 1970s, and which we believe is a prerequisite for women's ability to participate in paid work. As women previously often had to adjust their professional lives to the needs of their children, we saw that also from a previous presenter here in Korea. The development of affordable and accessible public childcare, in our case, have liberated women from having full responsibility for domestic labor. And this has further empowered both men and women to combine work and family life. Another key aspect of the preschool system is to make it affordable. Today, there's a maximum fee for daycare in Sweden equivalent to about 200,000 won per child per month. This fee decreases with the number of children, the size of income, and depending on whether the parent is single. So I dare to say that most Swedish families today feel that they trust that both parents will be able to continue working after having children, and that they will be able to provide good quality health care and education for their children. Today, and we spoke about that previously, many countries are struggling with the challenge of decreasing birth rates. And we know that a high and stable birth rate is crucial for the maintenance of social welfare and prosperity. So how do we enable men then and women to remain in the labor market while empowering them to have children and build families? And how do we overcome low birth rates while achieving greater gender equality? Now, as you've seen from my presentation, I and Sweden, we don't have the answer to all of those questions. And as I mentioned early on in my speech, Sweden is far from perfect. But I think it's worth reiterating, and I will end on that note, the need to consider the specific challenges, circumstances, and histories of individual countries when addressing demographic changes. While it might not be feasible nor desirable to copy the Swedish model directly to other societies, it is clear that in Sweden, advances in gender equality have contributing to maintaining higher birth rates. Making society more gender equal has worked well for us. It is morally right, but it's also economically smart, and it does seem to have a positive effect on population growth. Thank you so much for listening. 감사합니다.
다니엘 볼벤 대사님 발표 감사합니다.
Well, thank you for the great presentation, Mr. Ambassador. In June, I had an opportunity to visit Germany and Sweden and heard many anecdotes in those two countries which were reminded by your presentation. And the key takeaway for me is that Sweden is far from perfection, but it has solved the many issues and problems identified in Sweden, and Korea will be also able to overcome those challenges. That was very impressive. This 10 to 20% of the Swedish GDP was contributed by female workers. That was also impressive, and I feel that there's still gender gap in the labor market participation in Korea, and we have to reduce this labor participation gap in addition to pay gap between males and females. This will be very critical for us to raise our birth rates. And you also mentioned various policies like the income tax and parental leave for fathers, and raising the quality and access to public education before school. Those were also very impressive policies introduced in Sweden. This will help us a lot to find out our own path to overcome this challenge. I would like to move on to the second presentation. Ms. Kari Hansen, Ambassador of Norway, will give us a presentation of the Norwegian experience making gender equality work. She is working very hard on sustainable development and natural resources management. Please give a big hand to our second speaker.
Minister of Gender Equality, Hyun-sook, Excellencies, colleagues, distinguished participants, annyeonghaseyo. First, I would like to express my gratitude to the Minister Hyun-sook and the Ministry of Gender Equality and Family for inviting me to this important conference and also to share Norway's experience. Even though we have come a long way to make gender equality work in my country, we are facing many of the same economic and demographic challenges as Korea and many other countries, declining birth rates and aging population. But as it has been said already, we have so much to learn from each other, and every country has to find its own path. My name is Kari Hansen OVIND, and I'm Norway's ambassador to the Republic of Korea. Over the next 10 minutes or so, I will try to encapsulate both the importance of gender equality and shed light on Norway's resolute efforts in this pursuit, while also examining some of the progress made and what we still have to work on. First of all, gender equality is not only a fundamental human right, but it is a necessary foundation for a peaceful, prosperous, and sustainable world. All evidence show that women's financial and political participation is fundamental to value creation and economic growth. Hence, gender equality also holds great economic value for a country. We have seen this clearly in Norway. It has been said that the entry of women into the Norwegian workforce in the late 60s and 70s has in fact provided Norway with even bigger resources than all of our revenues from the oil and gas industry combined. And according to an OECD report, the GDP per capita in Norway would have been lower by $9,000 if female employment rate had remained at the levels of the mid-60s. This point to illustrate that gender equality is not only about human rights, it is about sound economic politics, achieving a balanced participation of both men and women in the society is essential to fully harness a nation's potential. Achieving gender equality is critical to our future, and of course our countries and the world indeed are facing difficult challenges in the years to come. We are talking about rapid climate change, food insecurity, and unsustainable international security situation, only to mention a few of those challenges. If we are to find the best solutions, we must draw from a pool of resources, perspectives, and talents from the entire population. We cannot merely draw from half of our population. So speaking of future challenges, the World Bank has estimated that nearly 2/3 of the world population live in a region where fertility rate is below the critical 2.1 threshold. And as the minister and also previous speakers has described, Korea is grappling with one of the lowest fertility rates globally, posing a significant challenge for the future and is crucial on the national agenda. In somewhat similar vein, Norway also contends with dwelling fertility rates currently hovering around 1.4 children per woman, from around 2 children per woman in 2009. Some might think that more women participating in the workforce is contradictory to battling low fertility rates. We believe the opposite. Financial independence is fundamental in parenthood. Equal working opportunities and equal distribution of welfare benefits is crucial to ensure such independence. Therefore, the solution to low fertility rates lies not in excluding women from the workforce after childbirth, but rather in affording parents, both men and women, the opportunity and flexibility to balance their roles in both employment and parenthood, as has been also underlined by previous speakers here. Let me also underscore that our efforts in Norway to promote gender equality has taught us that it is not enough to focus on women only. Gender equality should necessarily go both ways. If we want equality between men and women in the family and in the workplace, we must focus on the role of men and fathers as well. Equal rights, yes, but also equal duties. Just let me give you one example from Norway of the latter, and that is the extension of compulsory military service to women, just to give you one example. Making gender equality work is not done overnight or through one specific measure. It is a challenge that needs to allow to be overcome through changing social and cultural behavior. However, there are certain measures that can be taken in order to facilitate change. Allow me to share a selection of statistics that stand testament to the Norwegian achievements in this regard. Norway is considered one of the most gender equal countries in the world. Of 156 countries in the World Economic Forum Global Gender Gap report from this year, Norway is ranked second after Iceland. And from the early 1970s until today, the employment rate among women in Norway has increased by more than 25%. This means that the employment gap between men and women is narrowed to only 5%. This is the situation today. Also, 75% of Norwegian women aged 15 to 64 are employed. This is about 9% above the OECD average and one of the highest rates in Europe. When it comes to wages, the long-term trend is a gradual narrowing gap between men and women. On average, last year, women earned close to 90% of men's wages if we look only at a full-time employee. There is still a gap, but in an international context, the wage gap between men and women is relatively small in Norway. These achievements have not emerged by themselves. Rather, there have been persistent efforts over several years, numerous years, and a very strong pursuit for gender equality. I will not talk a bit about the most important actions taken in Norway to build a welfare society that supports gender equality. First, free and equal education. Free education is one of the main pillars of the Norwegian welfare society's efforts to achieve gender equality. In Norway, free public education also at university level and financial support for students have been an important policy measure to secure gender equality. Second, free health and welfare benefits. The aim of Norway's family policy is to give children the best possible start in life and to give parents equal opportunities to combine work and family life. Therefore, parental leave and accessible and affordable childcare are two of the key factors in the work towards achieving these goals. Parental leave in Norway is generous. We have 49 weeks of paid leave, and 1/3 of those weeks are earmarked to fathers only. So if the fathers do not take these weeks off work, this part of the paid leave is not transferable to the mother. So as many as 93% of all those who became fathers in 2020 took parental leave. 93%. Let me underscore that the father is strongly expected to take this leave. This is really a high expectation in the society. And if it's not taken, I think that family, colleagues, and friends, they will really think something is strange or wrong. In addition, workers also have paid leave to take care of sick children, and many workers enjoy flexible working hours. So this affordable childcare is really important to ensure that women are entering the workforce. And also a low fare of the kindergarten is also important to ensure. Approximately 375,000 won is paid per month. And the idea is that regardless of the financial situation of the family, there is access to kindergarten. As a result of this, more than 90% of Norwegian preschool children are in kindergartens, and this allows, of course, more adaptable work system, granting both parents the freedom to engage in employment even while raising young children. I would also like to mention changing norms, which is important, and also the rule of role models. I would like to conclude now. I see that my time is up, and I'd like to repeat that we have come a long way in Norway, but still obstacles remains. I will just mention that there is still largely divided in the labor market, and certain sectors are dominated by men and women, and this also results in the remaining wage gap among men and women. And also there is a disproportionate share of unpaid care work still, and this is also reflected that there is more women taking part in part-time jobs, just to mention a few of these obstacles. In private business too, we see less women taking part in the top managerial positions. But let me conclude. In a time when we have witnessed pushbacks on women's and girls' rights at both global and regional level, and especially as it was mentioned after the COVID-19 pandemic, it is important really to keep fighting for what is right and to keep pushing forward. And Norway would continue to work to overcome remaining gender equality challenges in our own country, and we would like to work very closely with other countries to advance gender equality and empowerment of women and girls towards achieving the Sustainable Development Goals. It has been mentioned already, and I repeat it, that gender equality is not only the right thing to do, it is the smart thing to do. Thank you for your attention, and let us all work together for a better future. 감사합니다.
네, 그 안내 대사님께서
Yes, Ambassador, I'm Kari OVIND. Thank you for the great presentation. You shared your country's experiences, and like the Swedish ambassador, you also mentioned that female participation or contribution to GDP is very important. It is also important for Korea too. And you also mentioned various statistics to illustrate the gender equality of your country. And in terms of gender equality, Norway ranked second. That is very impressive, and the pay wage gap is also being reduced. And among the women aged 15 to 64, labor participation rate is the highest, and the gender pay gap, the female to male ratio is at 90%, and there is still a room for improvement. But in Korea, that gender pay gap is just 31%. The female to male ratio is 31%. So our ministry is working so hard to reduce this gender pay gap and to reduce career breaks of mothers. So we are working very hard because we have much more room for improvement. Thank you for sharing the advanced experiences of Norway. I would like to move on to the third speaker, Tamara Mawhinney, Ambassador of Canada to the Republic of Korea. She was a UN Security Council. She led the UN Security Council campaign team, and she was also the Canada's mission to the UN in Geneva. And I also met her in person. And she, after taking office in Korea this April, she's working so hard to expand the bilateral relationship. She will give us a presentation on empowering women, sustaining families, Canada's holistic approach. You have the floor.
Minister, for the introduction, and thank you for getting such a great turnout today. Bonjour, annyeonghaseyo. It's really and an honor to participate in this conversation and focusing on the theme, coexistence of work and care responsibilities in a society challenged by low fertility rates. And like Korea, and as we're discovering many other countries, Canada too is grappling with low fertility rates and the social implications that come from an aging population. And these demographic shifts inevitably have gendered implications affecting women's choices around work, caregiving, and family life. So today I propose to delve into Canadian policies and initiatives aimed at reducing gender disparities, particularly in unpaid domestic labor and workplace dynamics. And I'll also touch on Canada's support for women seeking to balance career and family responsibilities, especially after childbirth. And this includes the policies and programs that Canada has implemented to enable women to maintain career progress even after taking time off for childbearing. And I'm trying not to speak from personal experience, but I have lived it, and I care about it very much. And I think the Canadian government really believes that solving demographic challenges and achieving gender equality, as previous speakers have mentioned, are interconnected objectives, not isolated goals. And so they require a collaborative, whole-of-society approach encompassing the public sector, the private sector, and, as has also been said, both women and men. So just to turn to some key initiatives to reduce gender disparities. First up, Canada's Parental Leave Program is a flagship initiative that incentivizes all parents, including fathers, to take time off work and to share caregiving duties. And I think you're seeing a bit of a theme emerge here. All parents who qualify for Canada's employment insurance have two options for parental leave based on their family needs. First is standard parental leave. Parents can share up to 40 weeks of benefits, with a caveat that one parent cannot receive more than 35 weeks. This feature encourages the second parent, usually fathers, to take the parental leave. In this standard option, parents receive 55% of their average weekly earnings, capped at 650 Canadian dollars per week in 2023. The second option is extended parental leave. Parents can share up to 69 weeks of benefits, and one parent cannot receive more than 61 weeks. In this extended option, parents receive 33% of their average weekly earnings, capped at $390 Canadian per week in 2023. So Canada's Parental Leave Program is aiming to give parents flexibility. They can choose between standard or extended. They can choose to share either leaves between themselves in however way they choose, in equal or different lengths of time between the parents and at the same time or one after the other, with or without overlapping for a time. Most importantly, sharing leave between parents results in additional time compared to only one parent taking the leave. And the goal is to give all parents time to care for their new child and to share caregiving duties. The province of Quebec has emerged as Canada's most paternity-friendly region, having implemented some of the most progressive parental leave policies. Since 2006, new fathers in Quebec can access 5 weeks of dedicated paternity leave and share 32 weeks of parental leave. And approximately 84% of new fathers in Quebec take paid paternity leave. In the rest of Canada, less than 13% of men took parental benefits between 2006 and 2019. But since additional weeks of benefits became available for parents to share in 2019, this percentage has already increased to 28.3% in 21-22. Significant investments are also helping to expand access to affordable early learning and childcare. The 2021 federal budget committed nearly $30 billion over 5 years in support of early learning and childcare, including building a Canada-wide early learning and childcare system. And the vision here is for families to have access to affordable, high quality, and inclusive childcare, no matter where they live. It is a plan to drive economic growth and to increase participation in the workforce, especially amongst mothers, and to offer each child in Canada the best possible start in life. While more progress is of course needed, Canada has shown, we've tried to demonstrate commitment through policy and investment to reduce those systemic disadvantages facing women across family life and the workplace. I wanted to touch on also supporting careers post-childbirth. Our employment protections ensure women cannot lose jobs due to pregnancy or maternity leave. Any employee who takes parental leave is entitled to either the same job or a comparable role upon returning from leave. Employers are prohibited from penalizing workers for taking leave. We also have transition support programs to help women successfully return to work after leave. And this includes provisions like gradual part-time work re-entry and flexible work arrangements. As I previously mentioned, access to affordable, high-quality, and inclusive early learning and childcare is really another essential component enabling women's workforce participation, probably the single greatest reason that leads to women to be tempted to leave the workforce after childbirth. Canada is working with provincial, territorial, and Indigenous partners to build an affordable, inclusive, flexible, Canada-wide early learning childcare system, and building again on the example in the province of Quebec. Quebec introduced heavily subsidized public childcare over 25 years ago, with parents today paying a reduced contribution rate of $8 a day for children under 5 in subsidized regulated childcare spaces. This makes childcare universally accessible. Key targets for the Canada-wide system include reducing parent fees and creating new high-quality regulated childcare spaces by March 2026. Other initiatives also make it possible for women to fully engage in careers while starting families, supporting gender equality and demographic sustainability. Flexible and remote work options are helping mothers better manage family responsibilities alongside professional ones, trying to draw the positive lessons from COVID. Mentorship initiatives aimed at empowering women seeking management roles following career breaks for childcare also contribute to meeting this goal. Canada remains committed to evolving policies that allow women to participate fully in the labour force without sacrificing career aspirations or family goals. But challenges still remain. So I just wanted to touch on efforts to eliminate gender equality and close gaps in the workplace. And a key milestone for us was passing proactive pay equity legislation 5 years ago, requiring equal pay for work of equal value in federally regulated sectors. This helps to address the gender wage gap. And multiple government funds and corporate initiatives also aim to support women rising to senior leadership roles, including mentorship programs, as I mentioned. 8 years ago, Canadian securities regulators instituted comply or explain rules in an effort to increase the number of women in the nation's corporate boardrooms and executive offices. The rules require gender diversity disclosure by publicly listed companies. This brings, we hope, transparency and accountability. We are also seeing an increasing number of leading companies implement practices like skills-based hiring, blind screening of applications, and structured promotion processes to minimize unconscious bias. But progress remains incomplete. We're still underrepresented in top corporate roles. In 2022, in Canada, women held just under 36% of managerial positions and 35% of seats on boards. So closing these gaps is going to require continued coordinated efforts by government regulators and businesses. Just to conclude, it's clear that achieving gender equality and tackling demographic challenges is a collective effort. It's not something that government can accomplish alone. And while Canada has made meaningful progress, we believe, through public policies, workplace regulations, and childcare investments, collaboration is still the key across all sectors. And what matters is that there is a shared commitment to fostering an environment where both men and women are equally invested in caregiving and professional roles. Businesses, too, must lead by implementing family-friendly practices, eliminating bias in hiring and promotion, and championing women leaders. We believe that Canada has built some momentum on this issue, but systemic change requires ongoing partnership. But we're hopeful that by working together, we're getting closer to a society of equal opportunity. Thank you so much. 감사합니다.
예, 감사합니다.
Well, thank you so much. As with the cases of Norway and Sweden, Canada also had the same experience of obligating fathers to take out a paternity leave. In Sweden, it's 3 months and 15 weeks for Norway, or at least 5 weeks from either a parent. And in the case of Canada, what is interesting is that there can be some overlap between both parents, and there are also 2 options for paternity leave, and for either of the options, different paid benefit will apply. There is an extended version. That's a very interesting point in the Canadian policy. From the early 2000s, Korea also has been working very hard to expand the access to early childcare. But we will also refer to the best practices of Canada to expand the access and raise quality of early childcare. And we also benchmarked the policies of the government of Quebec when it comes to the early child care service and the guaranteeing female employees a safe return to work. That is another issue for Korea to overcome. I think we share this concern for the more part-time works and flexible work environment, and how to take advantage of the hotelier community. These are very important issues. And when it comes to boardrooms and the senior managerial roles, we have to have more women in those high positions. We need to also make some improvements in this, and we have to revise our Capital Market Act to encourage more businesses to hire women in senior jobs, so that we can create a better, more equal environment for both men and women. Thank you so much for your great presentation. Now I'd like to move on to the fourth speaker, Alexandra Siddall, Deputy Head of Mission, Australian Embassy. She took office in Korea in 2021, and she's one of the first ones that I met in person. And last year, she also participated in this forum to talk about women's participation in economic activities in Australia. And now she will give us a presentation on the making Australia the most gender equal country in the world. Please give a big hand.
Thank you everyone for coming today. It's a very important event. I am very pleased to be here for the second time, but unfortunately the challenges that we face and that we discussed last time are not getting any easier. So the data shows that women in Australia are doing better economically, but because they are engaged in more paid work. But while this is a win, they are tired, physically, emotionally and politically, tired of bearing the consequences of their disproportionate caring responsibilities and pervasive gender bias. We see a compounding effect of disrupted careers, financial insecurity, and worse outcomes in well-being. That said, I don't want to be too pessimistic. 2023 is a historic time for gender equality in Australia. We have a new government with ambitious goals. I also believe it is a critical juncture for the Republic of Korea. Next. Australia faces, with the lowest birth rate in the OECD, as we have heard, at 0.78%, and a rapidly ageing population, increasing labour shortages and limited immigration, we know Korea is fast approaching a demographic cliff. Now, Australia faces similar challenges, and while our birth rate at 1.7%, or double that of Korea, means that our demographic challenges are less stark and are coming less imminently, we are acutely aware that our national power and the resilience of our economy and society relies on a healthy population and freedom of movement across our region in a way that meets the needs of our people and industry. For Australia, multiculturalism and people-to-people exchange have a role to play in finding a solution to our demographic challenges. And whilst we're here to talk about gender today, gender equality must go hand in hand with cultural inclusion if we are to address broader demographic challenges. But before I go into the details of Australia's domestic approach and our policy levers that we are pulling to become the most gender equal country in the world, I will just touch on quickly the current global situation and how it impacts on our consideration. Whilst we've seen some normalisation of our day-to-day lives with the reduction of our COVID risk, the fight for gender equality remains as important as ever. The post-pandemic world remains an era of insecurity and financial stress for women, including in Australia. The war in Ukraine has also raised the cost of living, on energy and food in particular, at unsustainable levels for all vulnerable people. That's why I was delighted to see President Yoon standing shoulder to shoulder with Japanese and American counterparts just last month, reaffirming the three leaders' commitment to promoting the full and meaningful participation of women in our societies. Like Korea, the Australian government is also committed to advancing our reputation as a global leader on gender equality, taking action not just at home, but across our foreign policy, overseas development assistance, and trade and economic priorities. We know that gender inequality undermines prosperity, stability, and security, and insecurity that we can ill afford in the Indo-Pacific right now. At home, in May last year, after Prime Minister Albanese was elected, the Australian government announced that our Minister for Women, Katie Gallagher, would also be the Minister for Finance and the Minister for Public Service. And this move has been critical in elevating gender equality within the Cabinet. It has meant that government priorities and decision-making more generally has gender front and centre. The good to key policy making is data and evidence, and we need to know the extent of the problem that we're facing before we can find the tools to deal with it. And that is why the Australian government has focused heavily on disaggregated data, gender statistics, and gender analysis, including on the caring responsibilities and the barriers to equal participation in professional life. Much of this data is analysed by the Australian Bureau of Statistics, our Treasury, the Department of Finance, and their specific Office for Women. The Office consciously works across government, across portfolios, to progress policies and programs to advance gender equality and women's empowerment in Australia and internationally. One of the ways we do this is through a women's budget statement. This was an election commitment by the Albanese government to evaluate the impact of all significant budgetary measures on women and examine how the allocation of public resources affects gender equality. The 2023-24 budget indicated a clear language shift towards community-focused responsibility, moving the narrative towards investment and away from trickle-down impact. Minister Gallagher introduced a suite of measures across the economy to address gender inequality. Now, Ms. Kim Yong-mi asked what type of country we wanted to hand down to our children. And I think that is the absolute critical question. It's a question of value. What do we value for our community? And for Australians, gender equality is key. And that's why we have made changes across government to implement this. The welfare system has been reformed to increase support for single parents and the unemployed, to provide energy price relief and rent assistance, and to help the transition to clean energy. We know that women live longer than men, and older women are significant users of healthcare. That is why the budget included significant support for aged care and healthcare income support. In terms of jobs, we've increased the number of skill training for women in apprenticeships and trainees. On tax front, we've also made some reforms because we understand that the female workforce participation patterns mean that women have lower superannuation balances at retirement. The government has also recognised the importance of structural reform to our industrial relations policy to build more inclusive systems. For example, the work of carers in social assistance industry such as nurses, childcare and home care workers, 76% of whom are women, this has been repeatedly undervalued by industrial relations tribunals in the past. And because workers in the care sectors are paid 33% less on average than workers in other sectors, unsurprisingly, like in Korea, the supply of care workers in Australia is inadequate. And just, as we've heard today, this is just at the time when we need them even more. We know that we'll have a shortage of around 40,000 nurses next year, probably 16,000 childcare workers, and people with disability by about 85,000 people next year. So these are huge numbers that we don't have and we need to fill. That's why the government has funded a 15% pay rise for workers in aged care and is looking at similar measures for childcare workers. Now, the Australian government is never content to stay still. We are committed to developing a national strategy to achieve gender equality. And while the strategy isn't finished yet, it's going to focus on women's economic equality and independence, leadership, representation and rights, balancing family and care responsibilities, health and well-being. Now, these are issues that will require effort from all of us. And it's such an important point, I want to reiterate it. First, gender equality is not about women's issues. If we use an Australian colloquialism, gender equality is about everybody having a fair go. Second, gender equality is the key to maximising our national power and our economic resilience. Third, women alone cannot be responsible for building a future-fit society. Men must be equal participants. And fourth, the government cannot be responsible by itself for implementing social change. Communities and individuals must also be heavily involved. Now, it's this very, very basic idea of equity, that Australia believes will lead to real social change at all levels and help create the conditions that support all types of families and deliver healthy and sustainable population growth. Through a whole of government effort, championed not just by our Minister for Women, but by all elected representatives, and working closely together with our international partners like Korea, we can slowly but surely address the structural barriers causing demographic issues while creating more inclusive economies and a more resilient region. 감사합니다.
네,
Well, thank you so much. Whenever I met Alexandra, the Madame Deputy Head of Mission, I met her during our campaign, and she just highlighted the message, the very important message, having a fair go. And the Minister for Women, Finance and Public Service of Australia, Katie Gallagher, said during her campaign that making Australia the most gender equal country in the world, and she explained to us strategies and policies to make this possible. And she mentioned evidence that analysis is very important, and women's budget is very important for better gender equality. Korea also has a women's budget, and not just budget and institution and programs. We also conduct evaluation for gender equality, and this total fertility rate is higher than the double the rate of Korea. Well, there's a very different situation from Korea. There are so many immigrants and the multiculturalism of Australia, and especially the old age, women in old age, how to guarantee the social service and quality life of these women. That is also very important. And health sector and caring sector, these sectors have lower wages, even though they have higher participation of women, and you are working for ways to improve a wage. Well, the situation is the same in Korea, so we have to also raise wages in sectors where female participation is higher. Whenever I see the cases of these countries, they all highlighted the message, this is a collective effort, not just the effort by the government. This is a very meaningful message. Now, last but not least, we'd like to hear presentation by Gareth Weir, Deputy Head of Mission of British Embassy, Seoul, and he took office in Korea in July 2022. He has deep and ample experiences in international management and development, and this is the 140th anniversary of forming diplomatic ties between the two countries, and he will give us a presentation on the Closing the Gender Gap, UK Experience and Ambitions. You have the floor. Thank you.
안녕하세요. 저는 Gareth입니다.
My name is Gareth Weir. Great to see you all.
Morning. Thank you, Minister, for the warm welcome and for organising this event to you and your team. It is an important event in its fourth year. I've been asked to share something of the UK experience of gender equality, and I want to start this presentation, if you like, from a place of deep humility. No country in the world has yet achieved gender equality. So in that sense, we are all learning from each other. And whilst we have made progress in the UK, one of the things that stood out for me recently was the Women's World Cup, which was an outstanding event, watched by record viewers in the UK. We are still not where we want to be or need to be in the UK against key metrics, such as gender pay gap, sexual harassment and violence against women, and gender composition at all levels of the workforce, but especially leadership roles. So in a sense, we are also on a learning journey. We have, however, done things that I think have helped, and I will talk about a few of them today. The first is the Equality Act, which I think has made an impact on equality and birth rates in our society. It was enacted in 2010, a landmark piece of legislation designed to promote fairness and protect individuals from any form of discrimination. The primary focus of the legislation was to eliminate any discrimination based on age, disability, gender reassignment, marriage, civil partnership, pregnancy, maternity, race, religion or belief, sex or sexual orientation. In a sense, it's what we value as a country, protected characteristics. The Act has played a key role in fostering a more inclusive and diverse society. It has ensured that people of all backgrounds, genders, sexual orientations and abilities have the same access to employment, education, healthcare and housing. Changing the legislation has helped shift social norms and behaviours and made it easier to identify and challenge discrimination-related barriers that previously hindered the personal and professional development of many individuals. I was struck, for example, on hearing the story this morning in the keynote about the type of questions a woman might get asked at interview. In the UK, that could be construed as discriminating based on gender. By encouraging employers to create inclusive workplaces and by holding organisations accountable for discriminatory practices, we have witnessed a more balanced distribution of income and opportunities across various demographic groups. The wage gap, as you can see here, has fallen by approximately a quarter over the last decade among full-time and part-time employees. But clearly, this is still not good enough. Any employer in the UK with 250 or more employees must report their gender pay gap every year. This level of transparency helps drive accountability and ultimately enables job seekers to make more informed decisions about the type of organisation they want to work for. Our experience of the UK of changing standards, behaviours and social norms through legislation may be relevant with the ongoing discourse here in the Republic of Korea on the impact of a potential anti-discrimination bill. So now to turn to the relationships between the Equality Act and birth rates. I think the two are intertwined through the lens of social and economic equality. As we know already, one of the key factors influencing birth rates is the status and economic well-being of women. The Equality Act, through its inclusion of gender and maternity as protected characteristics, has undoubtedly played a role in empowering women, enabling them to pursue their careers and aspirations without facing discrimination. We have also made progress in breaking down traditional roles and stereotypes. Policies such as the shared parental leave have been instrumental. This is an opportunity for both partners to share 50 weeks of leave up to 37 weeks of pay. They can choose to do it one-off together or to stagger the leave. It was before my time as a dad, unfortunately, but I have clearly seen the change with some of younger people coming through, including in the UK diplomatic network, where now we are able to build much more flexible careers. It also addresses some of the challenges of a career break because both parents continue to stay engaged in the labour market. As the slide sets out, it's a shifted in society norms where men are increasingly sharing the domestic responsibilities, including childcare. Couples are now likely to make more joint decisions about family planning, about shared maternity and paternity leave, and about how to distribute the responsibilities and mental load of bringing up children. This has certainly been the case for me and my wife. We still have much to do, and to give you a flavour of some of the other initiatives underway. Firstly, we understand that diversity fuels innovation and growth, which is why we're dedicated to creating more opportunities for female entrepreneurs. We have a task force on women-led high-growth enterprise, chaired by Anne Bowden, who is the founder of Starling Bank. This task force brings together women from diverse industries and regions across the UK, working together to tackle investment barriers, challenge outdated gender stereotypes, and open up opportunities for women of all backgrounds. The report is due early next year. Equally, in addition to supporting women in the business world, we are committed to supporting working parents. We recognise the vital role that parents, particularly mothers, play in our society. The UK government's childcare reforms aim to close the gap between parental leave ending and the government's entitlement offers, thus ensuring that more parents, especially women, can re-enter the workforce without undue burden. The government is predicted to spend in excess of £8 billion a year on free hours and childcare costs. And as was set out earlier by the UN lead, caring responsibility is not a commodity. It needs to be valued and invested in. We also know the importance of STEM, science, technology, engineering, and mathematics in our modern economy, and women have been historically underrepresented. We've made strides in increasing the number of girls studying STEM subjects. But the STEM gap remains, and the gap in careers still persists. We have the STEM Returners Pilot, which was launched last year, supporting parents and carers re-enter STEM roles by providing employability support and training, ensuring that women carers are not held back because of caregiving responsibilities. And in the realm of healthcare, we're working to improve women's access to reproductive health services and promote their overall well-being. The Women's Health Strategy sets out a 10-year plan to boost the health and well-being of women and girls, and prioritises a number of expanding health hubs, improving access to essential services like contraception and care for menstrual problems and the menopause. And we appointed our first Women's Health Ambassador last year, who will focus on raising the profile of women's health. Finally, work continues to combat the horrible violence against women and girls that remain disturbingly present both in the UK and around the world. In the UK, 1 in 4 women experience domestic abuse in their lifetimes, and women are 27 more times likely than men to receive online harassment and abuse. The UK government has published a comprehensive strategy to prevent abuse, pursue perpetrators and support victims, backed by substantial funding. So in conclusion, whilst we have a long way to go, I would observe that the key bits of legislation such as the Equality Act and the shared parental leave have had an impact on equality, helping to create a fairer and more inclusive society. This in turn has helped women, and in fact both parents, make more informed choices about careers and family planning. Importantly, this is not just a domestic issue. The ambition is to put women and girls in all of their diversity at the heart of everything the department I work for, the Foreign, Commonwealth and Development Office, does. We are committed to using all our diplomatic and development capability to improve lives, embolden and amplify women's organisations and voices, and stand up to those intent on holding back women and girls. In Seoul, we have a programme called Empower, which is one that works with and supports the next generation of Korean leaders, as an example. Our hope is that together, through forums like this, we can contribute to make progress towards a more inclusive and just future for all. 감사합니다.
마지막
Well, that was the last presentation of this session. He mentioned Equality Act. We also have the Framework Act for Gender Equality. Of course, details will differ, but having legislation on equity is really very important to eradicate discrimination across society. So Equality Act was the starting point in the case of UK, and businesses of more than 250 employees, they have to disclose their gender pay gap every year. That is very impressive. Korea does not have such requirement, but we will introduce the gender equality disclosure system or program this year. That was one of the campaign pledges of the Yoon Suk-yeol administration, and encouraging the males to also take out the paternity cares, very similar policies or the common policies across 5 countries. Diversity will drive innovation. That is also another takeaway message, because women, they are discouraged to become leaders in the private sector. So encouraging more women to become leaders in the private sector as well as startups, that is also a very shared policy goals between the UK and Korea. And myself, as a Minister of Gender Equality, I also want to see more women in the STEM sector so that women can be guaranteed equality in high-wage jobs. That's another takeaway point. And he also mentioned violence against the women and the girls. Mentioned the domestic violence, sexual harassment, sexual abuse against the women. And this is another very welcoming policy. international community should work together to eradicate violence against the women. When I visited New Zealand is a gender equal country, but people there also mentioned domestic violence. So creating violence-free society is also a shared universal goal across the country. Thank you for your great presentation. I've listened to all of the 5 countries, and all of the 5 speakers really kept to the time limit. So we have ample time, 20 minutes for the Q&A session. I'd like to open the floor to take up questions, and we will also select some of the questions posed by the online audience to have a general discussion. And I think that the ambassadors and the deputy heads of mission in this session, they all know each other very well, and they seem very friendly toward one another. I feel like I'm the only foreigner here, and you have had many opportunities to interact, so you can have a very free-flowing discussion amongst yourselves. And since you know each other very well, if you don't have any further things to discuss because you have already discussed very in-depth, and you mentioned the common sense and the common issues for gender equality. So if you already covered many points, then I will ask a few questions for opening. So Swedish ambassador was the first one to give us a presentation. You mentioned paternity leave for fathers and the obligation to female quota in the senior positions, 40% of the female quota. And that is one way to increase gender equality in boardrooms and senior positions. I just want to know how you achieved this higher gender equality and how you built a social consensus for gender equality. Korea is a very dynamic country, so now we have to also build a social consensus for gender equality. You have to have some talks with businesses and the labor unions. How did you build a social consensus for gender equality? That can be a very good starting point for discussion.
Thank you, and thank you for the question. I think, and again, I said it in my introduction, I want to reiterate it again, Sweden is not a perfect case. We still have some ways to go, certainly when it comes to female leadership and female positions, high positions in industry and on corporate boards. But I think when it comes to Sweden as a society, and I recognize many things that my colleagues have said here, I think that at some point there's been a tipping point where people have stopped seeing gender equality as a zero-sum game. And there's been a realization, I don't know how much the government has had to do with this and how much is just a development as a whole in society, where both women and men realize that we have equally much to gain from a gender equal society. And you can see this in many areas. I was also struck by my Norwegian colleagues' comment. We have the same in Sweden. Military conscription is now gender equal and that's gender neutral rather, and that shows that gender equality goes both ways. It's certainly about privileges, but it's also about obligations. So it's a difficult question to answer. I don't think there's one factor, but I think that as a society we have to realize that everyone has to gain from gender equality, and again, it is certainly not a zero-sum game between men and women. Thank you.
고맙습니다. 제로섬 게임이 아니라는 것.
Yes. There's a tipping point that we all realize that this is not a zero-sum game and that the country should make an effort. And Norwegian ambassador also mentioned that the military conscription should also be done for both genders, and I think gender equality should also go for both ways. There are different points for male and females where they are discriminated against the opposite sex, and males, they sometimes feel discriminated when it comes to the military enlisting issue. Well, that is also a very important topic. And Norway also mentioned the case that the many fathers, more fathers, 93% of the fathers take out maternity leave, and the gender pay gap is very low. And Norway has made great improvements on those fronts. Norway is one of the advanced economies when it comes to gender equality. But Norway wants to make a step forward. But what's the most challenging factor when you want to make a step forward, even though you are very advanced when it comes to gender equality?
Yes, thank you, Minister, for that question. And, I think it's a continuous also development. Let me just start a little bit with, we were talking about tipping points. I also mentioned this, the importance of role models, the gender equality in terms of legally introduction in Norway was back in 1970s, 1978. We started to have legal, introduced legal requirement for gender equality. And I think that when the first Norwegian Prime Minister Gro Harlem Brundtland ran her first government back in 1981, that made really headlines around the world, and it changed a lot also in the composition of the government and also the parliamentarian composition from back in the 1980s, and from that time it became normal to have 40 to 50% representation of men and women in government and in parliament, and that plays an important role, of course, but it is the society's change in general. And I think that legal implementations, but also incentives and role models, we need many different instruments actually to push gender equality forward. And I think that incentives are important. You mentioned, parental leave and the high percentage of men taking their father's quota. I think that, we have paid 49 weeks parental leave in Norway. And as I mentioned, 1/3 is reserved for the father, and the family actually lose that benefit if the father doesn't take up those 15 weeks. And of course that is a motivation also, but I think more so, fathers in Norway and families in Norway, they recognize the very importance of being together, bringing up the children together, and share not only, the work, but also the work and free time after work. That is a very important, I would say, part of family life, to have access to free time, but also to be able to pursue both careers. So that's why for the Norwegian family policies, the best way of a good start for a child is a top priority. Equally important is also that both fathers and mothers have the opportunity to pursue their career and contribute to the family life. So I think that was a long answer to a question, but there are so many different aspects that drive this gender equality agenda forward. And I think it has been mentioned that we need to work with, individually, businesses and politicians, and we need a combination of different instruments that drive this agenda forward. Thank you.
Once again, we heard that there was an act adopted in 1978, and that there's a high portion in the public sector in politics, and I feel that in politics and in parliament that female representation has increased to approximately 50%, and we see that there are many female ministers and a lot of representation. And yet I feel that you are putting a lot of effort to reduce the income gap. And you also talked about parental leave as an incentive. And regarding family life and work-life balance is a challenge for all countries, and I think Norway is a role model for other countries. We have the Canadian ambassador who is joined despite your busy schedule.
And what was impressive was flexibility in the parental leave, because you give two options. That is one a big difference from other countries' experiences. Why did you prepare two options for paternity care? Can you give us the reason? And the Quebec government has the best practice, and in senior positions of businesses, to have more women in the senior jobs of private businesses. We also revised Capital Market Act to have more women in senior positions. And what was your effort to have more women in senior positions? And there are many immigrants in Canada. How did you create harmony between the different immigrants and Native people and the Canadian people? How did you promote gender equality despite the diverse people in your society?
Thank you very much for that question. And just to build, there were a couple of expressions that have emerged. First of all, trying to avoid that zero-sum game, that one group isn't advancing at the cost of another. I think that's so critical in this discussion, and it was very much part of Canadian policy calculations. And also, as you were speaking, I was thinking of that great sort of equality mantra: you cannot be what you cannot see. And so important. You referenced, Minister, the importance of representation. We have to be able to see role models for everyone to be able to see themselves in those roles. But I also really wanted to thank you for making a reference to immigration in Canada. And for me, the discussion on gender equality and perhaps our, if I may, maybe my colleagues won't be happy for me saying this, but our relative slowness to moving towards some of those mechanical policy changes on gender, childcare, maternity leave, has also been because we've already had such a long background of focusing on diversity and inclusion. And so I think I made reference in my comments to how everything is tied together, everything is integrated. But our discussions on gender equality in Canada very much come and are attached to our conversations about diversity and inclusion. And when we've really put a great emphasis on feminism. We have a government who states very clearly that they are a feminist government, and we try to see that through all aspects of policies, international policy, finance policy, across the board. We also have really tried to bring in a focus on gender-based analysis. But sometimes I want to encourage colleagues not to be fooled by the words gender or feminism. This really is about including everybody. And I think in the current discussions in Canada, we're looking at how women fare in the economy, but also individuals with multiple identities. You can be a woman, but you can also be disabled, you can also be Indigenous, you can also be racialized. How each individual is going to live that differently, and they have to be able to see themselves in the policies that are able to adapt. We can't impose one approach, a zero-sum game, just to solve issues relating to women. It has to be a little bit more adaptable than that. So I think that's where the desire for flexibility comes from. It's also where our great humility comes from. We know we have many challenges, but we're trying to take the strengths and what we've learned about inclusiveness to bring that to improve our statistics on women's participation in the workforce in particular. Thank you.
Yes. Canada also took a very long time to build a social consensus and creating a suitable environment and showing more women in senior positions to serve as role models. This is not a zero-sum game. This is a repetitive message first echoed throughout this session. And now we'd like to move on to Australia. You mentioned various gender equality policies.
This year, I understand that you are pursuing a paradigm pursuing gender equality with the new minister. You did explain briefly about the agendas that are being pursued, but since you did not have time, if you would like to introduce other policies that are being pursued.
Thanks very much, Minister. I think it's fair to say that we've had a consistent policy that is supportive of gender equality for a very long time. In 1902, Australia was the second country in the world to get the women to get the vote. And in 1976, we had the first minister for women. So this is not something that's new. It is a consistent policy objective and something that we are really trying to advance every single day. It's also something that I think is equally applicable to both sides of politics. So it's not a politicized debate, and it goes very much to that principle around fair go and equality. So that's sort of the history of why we are doing what we're doing. The fundamental shift that we are making now is around the integration of policy advice and the integration into a whole of government approach, which means that policy for women or about gender equality, is not just for women. It's about health policy, it's about tax policy, it's about industrial relations, it's about representation. So that, to go to the points that my colleagues have made, these policies are not specific to one segment of society. It's about changing the whole way in which society values people as a whole. In terms of extra specificity, there were things I didn't get to mention. Some simple things that are changing how women are valued. For example, because of workforce participation patterns, women and their gender pay gap, women generally have lower superannuation or pension balances on retirement. One of the things that we are trying to do is look at the timing of the payment of superannuation. It sounds very boring and it is very, very technical, but really what it means is non-payment of superannuation most commonly affects women because they're the lowest paid employees in part-time work. So what we're trying to do is look at the structural causes of discrimination and trying to address those things, be it through taxation policy or industrial relations policy. I think my colleague mentioned the FIFA World Cup, and I do think that is actually a really important metric. That was the first time that we have filled stadiums with people watching women's sport. And it's the first time that the taxi driver, when you talk about the game tomorrow night, doesn't ask you if they mean men's soccer or women's soccer. It was just the game. So that was a really important mind shift or cultural shift in the way in which female activity was seen as equal, and I really look forward to the day when Korea can host a Women's World Cup with equal fervour, and really, thank you.
Thank you for your wonderful comments that women were able to vote for the first time in 1902 in Australia, that these efforts were not sudden, that it has been consistent, and you talked about superannuation pension, and that if women do not or receive less superannuation pensions, then this will impact them the most. That is why industrial relationships and tax-related policies need to be changed and reviewed. And regarding the pension that women receive is lower than men, and so this is being put into consideration. In Korea, we are in the process of reforming our national pension system. And I think we need to review those issues, and this is an area that we can work on together, I believe. And for the World Cup, I hope that happens one day. So you don't need to mention whether it's women's or men's World Cup. It's just FIFA. Today we are talking about gender equality. So I think that we need to realize the value of men and women together, and I believe that that is a very meaningful example that you gave us.
Ask my question for the Deputy Head of Mission of the British Embassy Seoul. You mentioned the Equality Act. It has great impact on fertility rate and the female employment caring and women's participation in the labor market and fertility rate. They should be raised together at the same time to guarantee more autonomy of women. So it was introduced in 2010. It has been 13 years. So can you give us more details about the impact of this Equality Act, unexpected positive impact of the Equality Act that was passed in 2010?
Thank you, Minister. Yeah, so I think this is an example, I think, where the government put in place a piece of legislation perhaps ahead of public consensus on equality. So in the sense, the government was leading the debate by changing the legislation. And that inevitably then forced people, companies, civil service, ourselves, to have a conversation, because they set out some clear standards of what discrimination was and was not. And then they were intent on holding people to account against those standards. So suddenly there was a lot more scrutiny and transparency around equality. That led, I think, to much more debate in companies, in organizations about what they were doing, and we talked a bit about sort of micro unconscious bias all the way through to outright discrimination. But those sorts of debates have happened since the legislation, where now we have lots of conversations and training about unconscious bias and ensuring that when we do recruitments, for example, in the civil service, they are blind recruitments, so that we try to remove any unconscious bias in the process. Equally, I think it's changed the narrative for younger people coming through the system. So if I talk to younger people who've just started their careers, they demand much more of the organizations they work for. They want more flexible working relationships. They want shared paternity, maternity leave as part of the package of joining that organization. So I think it's changing businesses because the labor market is demanding some of those changes. Equally, those same young people are demanding more changes as potential voters. So political parties are now under more scrutiny in terms of what they are doing to address some of these underlying challenges. I also think it's thrown into array the question of media and how media portray gender in the world, particularly in the UK at the moment, in terms of what are some of the messages, what are some of the ways in which gender and women's roles are portrayed in mainstream media. And it's allowed us to be more challenging, perhaps, of some of the stereotypes that are implicit within media, which, as we've talked about, if you can't see some of the changes or hear in the news or see in the TV programs that you watch some of the changes that we value are trying to get to, it makes it much more difficult. So again, it's opened up space to challenge media about how they're doing that presentation.
Well, I also asked the question before. We have this Framework Act for gender equality, and the other ministries have different legislations to prevent discrimination. So our situation is different from that of the UK, but we also have a blind screening criteria in the recruitment process of the private sector. So we also have very similarities in terms of policies. We have Framework Act for gender equality, and we also have this anti anti-discrimination recruitment process and legislation that guarantees the anti-discrimination. Even though there are slight differences between countries, we also have many similarities. So there was a positive impact from the Equality Act, and likewise, Korea is also seeing positive impact from our commitment. We have 4 minutes left. So we will just read some of the questions that we received from our online offline audience. But important questions were already covered. So if I state some of the questions, I'm not sure which one should answer to these questions. But in Korea, there are so many self-employed people, self-employed business people, and these small merchants. We Of course, it is very easy to introduce gender equality programs in big businesses, but what about startups or self-employed people, small merchants? For those people to have a better work-life balance, what kind of policies and programs do you have in your own respective countries? In Korea, we have more self-employed people. We have higher ratio compared to other countries. So can you share with us your best practices for gender equality in small businesses? What about the Canadian ambassador?
Thank you. I think that's such an interesting question because so much economic growth and drive comes from small business. And that's such an important part of our economic strategy is to favor small business. I think it's also about trying to ensure women have equal access and all marginalized or vulnerable groups have equal access to the ability to set up a business and have the wherewithal. So there's definitely challenges in terms of the paid leave because in a smaller structure, if one person takes leave, the business comes to a halt. But I think it's very important to encourage access and encourage women seeing themselves as business leaders, business startups, and getting into some of the different areas where women are less represented. So it's encouraging right from the beginning, as well as creating the policy framework to provide support across the social support system. I don't know if others have views on small business.
Maybe just one point to supplement what our Canadian colleague just said. To provide, coaching and training program specifically targeting at young women who are interested in setting up entrepreneurship, and that is also something that the industry association also provide mentorship and training program to inspire and stimulate activity also for smaller businesses. So that is one important contribution also from the private sector itself. But it's definitely an area where access to these welfare programs is of course very important. Thank you.
Well, thank you for your perspectives. Our ministry, to encourage more women to participate in the labor market, we supported women to start to their own startups, and we supported women in self-employed sector. And the Ministry of Industries and the Ministry of Startups, Ministry of Welfare, Ministry of Science and Technology, all different ministries of Korea, they have their own programs just to support female startup CEOs and the female self-employed people. We have various benefits and programs, but it is very difficult to implement those benefits in very small workplaces and self-employed people. So supporting them with better social security programs. That is another challenge that we have to address. Even though we have programs, these people are not in a position to actually take out the paternal leave or use those programs. So this is another point that we have to make improvements. Another question that I have, this question is directed to the Swedish ambassador. So when the paternal leave is obligated, this can be another burden on businesses and employers. How did you change perceptions of these businesses to give incentives to have more employees taking out on the paternity leave? And this can also lead to some anxiety or animosity between different sexes. If there was some conflict between men and women, how did you overcome those sexual conflict? And when you returned from the paternity leave, you were not worried about your job? And this is a very cute question. The 3 questions in total.
Thank you. No, it's a great question, all 3 parts of it. I think, so parental leave, it's not obligated, of course, you don't have to take it if you don't want to, but what I mentioned in my presentation is out of the parental leave that's given, if it's not shared, if parts of it is not shared, it disappears, so to speak. So there's an incentive given by the government for both the woman and the man to partake in parental leave. So that's an important aspect. I think when you look, 2 things that has happened in Sweden briefly is that companies, including smaller companies, have really seen both the social and the economic benefits also to the company of parental leave. So many companies actually top up what the state replaces in terms of income. So if you're a high earner, for example, there might be an economic disincentive to take parental leave. Many Swedish companies actually compensate for that because they see that parental leave as such is good for the company, it's good for the workers, it incentivizes them in the long term. And then, of course, the very interesting question, what does this do to your career? My short answer in Sweden today, taking parental leave does nothing to your career in the sense that it's neutral when it comes to career development. It's anecdotal, but I can say for myself that you take parental leave, you come back to your work, it's just the way it was when you left it, right? And the more people that take parental leave, I think the more the better the environment becomes for parental leave. It just becomes something that you do. And I would actually add that today in Sweden, not taking any parental leave for your kids could potentially even be a little bit detrimental to your career. People would start wondering, what is it about this person that, he or she doesn't want to be with his or her kids. So it's about long-term change and about creating an environment where legislation actually works, not only on paper, but also in practice.
예, 제가
Yes, that the last part of the question was a very cute and personal question, but he mentioned a very important point. This is a win-win situation. That is a very key takeaway of his message, creating an environment where companies can grow together with employees by giving out paternity leaves. And when people return from paternity leave, there should be no change to the person's jobs and works and positions. So this is a very important point. Now I'd like to turn to Norwegian ambassador.
And you said that now women must go to the military. They have to carry out military service. Does this lead to better gender equality? And there's another question from a housewife in Korea. What are the differences in family life and relationship between parents and children, and relations in the family? What are the differences that you see between Korea and Norway?
Yes, thank you for that question. Of course, in the Norwegian Armed Forces, voluntarily women has taken part for many, many years, but back in 2015, it was introduced as a universal conscription in Norway. So it has always been conscription for men in the military service in Norway, but from 2015 it was made a universal conscription, meaning that both men and women at the age of 18 were called upon to do their military service. And it's a system in Norway that you have to be screened, or you have to be tested. There are lots of sessions you have to go through before you actually do your military service. But at the moment, since this was introduced, some 33% of the conscripts in Norway are women. So the background is, of course, that we need to, the principle of equal rights but equal duties, as I mentioned, but also that we need to draw on, the talents, the competence of all our population. That is really the thinking behind it. And then when it comes to the difference in family life, well, what I know, talking also about myself, is that the family life in Norway, we really cherish our free time, and that free time we like to spend with family and our kids, but also we like to enjoy nature. I just have to say this because that is something that I really am very happy for, living in Korea, that also I feel I have a very easy access to nature, and that means a lot. I think we have that in common, that we like to hike, we like to walk, we like to spend time outdoors, and this is definitely important to the work-life balance in Norway. So of course, with a more equal situation on the workforce, and also have this same access to parental leave in Norway, we also have, I would say, more equal access to that free time that we cherish so much, being together. Thank you.
저희가 지금 시간을 사실
We are actually out of time. We were scheduled to end by 12:30. Our Q&A session has been slightly extended.
So in a gender equal society, what is the role of men? Can you give us a brief answer to that? First, Alexandra, and after that, Gareth.
Well, again, I have to speak from my family's experience. My husband has accompanied me, this is just an anecdote, but my husband has accompanied me on my diplomatic posting, and he is essentially in charge of the children. So I think what I'm trying to say from a personal note is that men in Australia have embraced the idea that children are their children as well. It's not babysitting, it's children are an equal responsibility and equally, loved. And that there's a lot that children can learn from engaging with both parents. I am very pleased that there are increasing numbers of men in the workforce that are working flexible hours. So a lot of my colleagues back in Canberra will work 3 days a week, men and women, and that is to enable their partner, whoever that may be, to also spend more time at home and to spend more time with the children. So there is I think, an acknowledgement that there's more to life than work, that life is something to be cherished, to use your words, and we need to reset how we think about engaging. That's not to say that we're not working hard when we do work, but I think there's a different way of thinking about things, and that includes men.
Thank you, Minister. What a great question to finish on. I mean, so from my perspective, I'd say the role of men, again, personal perspective. So firstly, to really understand the challenge, try to understand what it's like for women particularly, and understand some of the barriers that they have and are facing. So empathy and understanding. Then I'd say I'd challenge any kind of preconceived roles around caregiving and around bringing up a family. And being open to that challenge, that it's not preordained necessarily who does what, and being more flexible potentially to share that sense of responsibility. And again, it comes down to me to a question of values, what your values are as a society, as an organisation you work for, or as a family that you live in, and having values which basically are based in, rooted in gender equality, I think is at the heart of it.
예, 이제 끝내야 될
It's time to finish this session. Thank you for sharing your own experiences. We felt some differences, but we also realized the similarities between different countries to reach a very appropriate conclusion. There were so much more questions received from the floor. Please kindly understand that we didn't have enough time to tackle each question. We shared some experiences of different countries in session 1. Please be with us until the end. Session 2 and session 3 have useful presentations as well. So you will have a very fruitful time if you stick with us throughout session 2 and 3. I'd like to extend my gratitude to all of the participants on the floor. Once again, thank you for your attention. With this, I'd like to conclude session 1. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much. We will now conclude session 1 of Korea Gender Equality Forum 2023. We heard about the various cases of different countries, and we heard about what efforts need to be put in order to realize gender equality. And we also had an opportunity to ask questions in real time with the presenters. I think that made the forum and the first session even more meaningful. I would like to thank Minister Hyun-sook Kim and also the speakers for their contributions. Thank you very much. We will now have a lunch break for an hour and a half, and we will see you again at 2.